Hello and welcome to Spotlight North Carolina Cooperative Extension. I'm your host, Rebekah Benton. North Carolina Cooperative Extension is located in all 100 counties, including the Koala boundaries. We are comprised of two land-grant universities, NC State University and NC A&T State University. We enjoy bringing groundbreaking research here to our communities. And today I have with me Richard Goforth. Richard, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I'm one of the 4 area specialized agents. So we, unlike your typical county agent that's based in one specific county, we cover multiple counties. We are charged with kind of helping those other agents in specialized areas. So I work with poultry, both small and large producers. Primarily we focus with commercial production directly, and then we kind of serve as a backup or a help to the typical livestock agent that you'd find in your individual counties to help them with small and backyard flock type issues or concerns that the public may have. I've been doing this for about 16 years now. Prior to that, I worked on campus in the Prestice Department of Poultry Science, and I worked for a commercial quail farm for a few years doing hatchery management.
Now, how did you get started in poultry?
Just chance. I actually went to NC State as an animal science graduate, worked with swine doing research while I was an undergrad, and started originally working on campus with swine. That was a time-limited position based on the research grant that we had. The professor I was working with was retiring, and the grant money was running out, and there happened to be an opening in the Poultry Science Department to head up the crew that took care of all the research and lab birds and the birds that we use for teaching the students on campus and in our research facilities nearby at Lake Wheeler. So I took that opportunity to move into that role and just grew from there. And part of that training, I used continued my education, went on and got my master's in extension education, and then when the opening came for this position, it just seemed like a natural fit, and I've been very happy here ever since.
Well, we are absolutely glad to have you and your expertise today. So let's start out with what is HPAI?
That is actually, it stands for high pathogenic avian influenza. So avian influenza is commonly referred to as bird flu. So it is an influenza or a flu type that affects birds or avian species. Typically, it's broken down into high path and low path forms. When it's high path, that means that it actually infects lots of birds, and the mortality and the sickness rate is very, very high. With a typical high path outbreak on a commercial farm, we'll often see mortality rates as high as 90-95% of the birds will die from the actual infection.
Wow. Now, how is it spread?
It can be spread primarily bird to bird through fomites. So either they're particles that come out of they would breathe out, or the mucous membrane, or through the feces. They'll shed it in their feces as well. So that can be spread where the birds come into contact with any of those particles, whether directly from bird to bird in the barn, or if we as humans tend to be our biggest vector is if we step on some feces or bird poop that happens to have the virus in it, and then we carry it into another facility or track it into the house where a new flock of birds are, then they could be exposed to it. It is theoretically possible for it to travel through the air, but much like we've learned with COVID, the actual travel of those particles that we breathe out and expel through our respiratory process, they don't travel very far. So, once it's in a house, it's going to travel from bird to bird very quickly when in close quarters. But to travel from farm to farm or house to house, typically it has to be tracked or carried in through another source or vector.
Now, I was a little confused. You said the word fomite. Is that just another word for the virus?
That's kind of a overall catch-all for things like spit, saliva, mucus droplets, any kind of feces, urine, all that. It's kind of a generic term that covers all those things.
Okay. All right. So how should I protect my small flock?
Primarily, the best thing anyone can do is biosecurity. So that means where you're taking precautions to limit the risk and reduce the amount of vectors that are possible to the birds. First thing, of course, is limit visitors. So people that don't need to be around the birds or in the facilities, that don't work there or have a specific job or duty to do, if we keep everyone else out, we're going to greatly reduce the chance of somebody bringing something in. And then the other key thing for those that do have to go in is to practice good sanitation, biosecurity practices. So as a small flock owner, it's often easiest to have a dedicated pair of shoes or boots that you use in your coop or with your birds when you go out to care for them. On our commercial facilities, they'll either have dedicated boots in the barn, or they'll have plastic boot covers and shoe covers. They'll typically wear the disposable like Tyvek coveralls, hair nets, anything to make sure that any of the dust and particles they pick up is left in the house, thrown away, and not carried from house to house or farm to farm. You can even go as far as showering in and out. And for our small flock people, it's also good to keep in mind that when you go places like to the local feed store to pick up feed, definitely there's a time where you want to wear different shoes, where you want to wear, you probably want to make a point of doing that at a time so that before, if you go pick up feed, you may want to make sure before you bring that into the facility that you actually shower and change clothes completely. Because obviously if you're going there, you've went out and you've cared for your birds and you go down to the local feed store, you're walking down the same aisle that everyone else who's there looking for feed for their poultry. And if you share that walkway and that pathway, you can easily pick up something on your shoes and bring it back to your birds. So biosecurity is always our first defense. Making sure you're also taking care of keeping other vectors out. Wild birds are our other biggest spreader. That's how it gets spread usually from farm to farm. So making sure you're keeping your birds away from wild birds and limiting their exposure to those. Keeping the inside of a building if possible, or making sure you have netting or other kinds of deterrents that maybe keep the wild birds from wanting to come near your birds. And if you happen to have a pond or something on your property, definitely making sure your chickens and turkeys and stuff don't go down and visit the pond, because migratory birds tend to carry the virus more than our like songbirds that we see in our trees. They also spread it more because they typically eat and drink near the water source, so they're going to have their droppings in and around the pond, so that's going to get washed into the water, and in that muddy area around the water, that cool damp temperatures that typically exist, the virus can often live for 3 or 4 months easily.
Oh, wow.
So if you're, even after that flock of geese that migrate through, several months after, the virus still may be viable in the pond water in that area around there. So keeping your birds away from that is very, very important.
Now, what should or could the general public do to help with the safety of this?
One of the biggest things you can do is to make sure that you help with the growers and farms with their biosecurity by honoring their request as far as visiting. Most of our commercial farms will have signs posted, posting there's no visitors, and visitors have to sign in and log in if they do. If you are going to visit a farm, make sure you're wearing clean clothes and shooting that you don't wear around birds if you have any at home. If you do come in, for some reason, if you were going to come in contact with birds, the typical rule is to have at least 72 hours of no bird contact before you visit another facility that would have birds. So those are good things that you can always help out your growers with. And then often the general public is a little bit concerned about, will the bird, can I catch bird flu? Can it, cause me any harm? Is it safe to eat the eggs or the meat? This particular strain, or most strains of avian influenza, are not really transferable to humans. There's been no direct transfer from human to human of bird flu. There have been a few cases, primarily in Asia, where this particular strain, the H5N1 strain, originates. but there has been no really confirmed cases in North America of humans actually contacting it. And when we do have outbreaks on farms, the meat and birds that and eggs that are used there, they do not enter the food chain. So there shouldn't be any concerns there. And even if there were some way that some did enter in, proper cooking of the meat or the eggs will make sure that you don't have any issues with it.
That's good to know. That's good to know. So I also hear that HPAI is blamed for the increase in our egg prices that we have going on. So is that true? And if so, how does it affect them?
It is partially true, definitely. It plays a role. In the U.S., we've lost a little over 40 million laying hens due to the current outbreak. This started in 2022 and is continuing into this year. So those birds are removed from production, and because of the lifespan or the age of those birds, typically it takes a chicken about 20 to 22 weeks of age before they reach sexual maturity and they can start laying eggs. Mm-hmm. And they lay on a curve, so it takes several more weeks before they kind of get to their peak or maximum production. Mm-hmm. And then they'll continue laying for about a year at that level on a commercial facility. So when we remove those birds, it takes quite a while to replace that number of birds again, compared to our meat or our broiler birds that we typically eat. Mm-hmm. They only takes them about 6 to 9 weeks before they're aged to be harvested. So they're much younger, and it's much easier and quicker turnaround for us to replace that lost bird or meat in the cycle. Whereas with our egg layer types, it takes much longer. So that's part of it. But, the industry has faced inflationary challenges that all the other sectors of our economy have faced. Fuel, feed costs, which are typically the largest cost for any animal production, mm-hmm. any non-fixed cost anyway. Obviously, the facilities cost more, but that can be spread over many years. But the non-fixed cost feed is usually the largest output for any grower. So the war in Ukraine has also had a big impact on grain supplies and feed stocks for livestock as well as for human consumption. So all those factors together are what's driving up our current egg prices. It coincides with law of supply and demand.
That's true.
We may not be experiencing severe shortages where there are not necessarily eggs available, but in order to keep that from happening, they increase prices so people will tend to self-regulate how much they buy so that we don't have complete shortages or outages in many places.
Is there a time that maybe egg prices would return back to normal?
Yes, hopefully they will, or what exactly normal becomes, as we like to say with the pandemic, is going to be a new normal after the inflationary period does reside, hopefully, and if we get HPAI under control, yes, definitely we should see some reduction in egg prices eventually, but it will probably persist at least another 6 months to a year, and a lot of factors will depend, like I say, what kind of migratory, the pattern that returns here in our spring with the migrating birds returning back north. If we have another severe outbreak and lots of outbreaks, then that's going to continue to increase the timeline. But if we can get through this migration period with little or few outbreaks, and hopefully that will not play any major role, and it seems inflation overall is starting to cool off a little bit with the changes that some of the interest rates and things are starting to have. So hopefully we will see a reduction in price. I doubt they'll ever go back to the pre-levels again, but hopefully we'll get back to a more manageable.
Hopefully, I know many consumers will be looking forward to those prices leveling out.
Yes.
I do believe. Well, we are just about out of time. I do want to ask, if somebody needed to find out information about chickens, eggs, they will contact their local county livestock agent, and then questions would go to you if they couldn't answer. Is that how that works?
Typically, yeah. We like for our small flock and our typical consumers to start with their county offices, and those agents can always call on us for additional resources and backup. And then if we don't know the answers, we can also work with our specialists on campus at NC State and NCA&T State University.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. Audience, thank you for tuning in. If you have more questions, please contact your local North Carolina Cooperative Extension, and we will see you next time.